Good afternoon. This is Kristin Dziczek with the Center for Automotive Research. We're going to wait for everybody to come into the room here a little bit, and then we'll get started. So thank you for joining us, and we'll get started in just a moment. Again, thank you for joining the Center for Automotive Research for our webinar today on the Restart Playbook. People are still joining in. We're going to get started right at the top of the hour in about 2 minutes. Thanks again for joining us. Okay, by my watch, we're at the top of the hour here at 1 o'clock. My name is Kristin Dziczek. I'm the Vice President of Research for the Center for Automotive Research in Ann Arbor, Michigan. We want to thank you for joining us today on this webinar. We've got a little bit of housekeeping to take care of first. Let me get to the slides here. This is going to be mostly a webcam webinar. There's a webcam section of the control panel where you can make sure that you are seeing the 3 presenters, myself, Jim Tobin, and Aaron McCarthy. You can submit your questions in the question section of your control panel. Those will go right to our organizers, and we'll make sure that we address the questions that come in as they come along. So that's how you're going to work your end of the webinar, and I really appreciate you coming on board. There will be a recording of this webinar available on our website, hopefully later today. So you can check back at cargroup.org/webinar, and you can see the recording, and you can also share that link with others who you might think would benefit from the materials we're going to cover. We have a couple of upcoming webinars at the Center for Automotive Research. We're trying to do this on a regular basis. All of our past webinars are also on our website. Under cargroup.org, there's a COVID-19 section. Next week, we're going to cover additive manufacturing in automotive and how that is responding to the COVID-19 crisis. And the week of 4/20, we're going to look at the dealership side of things. There are sponsorship opportunities available for all of our webinars, and Sean Whitehouse is your contact at swhitehouse@cargroup.org for more info on that. We also have a Donate Now button on our website. Most of our COVID-19 research is self-funded out of the Center for Automotive Research. We're a dinky little nonprofit in Ann Arbor, and we really do appreciate the support we have from our industry partners. And if you're benefiting from the work that we're doing, we'd appreciate your support. And that ends my slideshow. Let me go back to stop sharing. You should see just the 3 screens now. And I'm going to get involved into our topic. COVID-19 really started with the potential for massive supply chain disruption, largely from China and other Asian producers, and has now grown to concerns about supply chain disruptions from all sources around the world. China's production and sales were down roughly 80% in February, but demand is starting to pick up there as manufacturing is beginning to come online. Workers across the globe are concerned about their health and their families' health as they return to work, including those on the front lines in the medical system or in essential employees who are delivering goods, working in grocery stores, or manufacturing the personal protective equipment and other medical devices that we require. I'd like to get a sense from you guys about where your concerns are with restarting production. So there's a poll that just opened on your screen. Sean, if you could, are you going to screen share the poll? Sean, we can't see the poll, so. Okay, he says it's working. I can't see it. So we'll look for the answers to the poll. The poll is open now. And we're asking, what are your biggest concerns? And so the number one concern, it appears from our attendees, is supplier disruption. Now, those supplier disruptions can come from all sorts of sources, whether they be domestic or import supplier disruptions. They could be supplier insolvencies, which we are certainly familiar with in the auto industry, going back to a little more than a decade ago, as we saw many smaller companies not able to weather the storm. So supplier disruptions are a big concern, and at some point we are going to have to get back to business, and that's likely going to be before we have an available or effective COVID vaccine or treatment. And when that's determined is COVID is in the driver's seat here. So we don't quite know when that will be. And then the government authorities, of course, also have a role here. So how is the industry going to rev up our engine and get going again is the subject of today's discussion. My guests today are Jim Tobin and Aaron McCarthy. Jim is Magna's International EVP and President of Magna Asia. So he's got firsthand experience with how Magna came back on board in China and across Asia, including the recent reopening of Wuhan. And Aaron is Magna's Chief Human Resources Officer. Jim and Aaron are here to discuss the business human resource concerns that must be addressed to restart automotive production in North America, essentially our restart playbook. So Jim, Magna is one of North America's largest suppliers, and you've taken a leading role in the industry's restart playbook activity. And I know you're personally playing a pivotal role in bringing the industry together for a plan so that we can all get back to work. Can you tell us more about the coordinated efforts that you're involved in with the automakers, other suppliers, and other key industry stakeholders, and how that's playing out? We can't hear you, Jim.
Thank you. I took myself off mute.
Okay.
Thank you for having us here today. Yes, it's been a lot of activity over the last month of March as we came out of the epidemic in China. And when we saw indicators in Europe that it was starting, and we saw data over here, we said we had to get moving. Early March, we put together what we call COVID-19 executive management team, led by Don Walker, who's the captain, and Swami Katagari, our president, as a co-captain. And one key thing that we said is we got to make sure the industry comes back up when it needs to come back up, and we need to have a playbook. So we were able to gather all the OEMs by about the 17th of March and said, hey, we need a common playbook that we get through the automotive supply base. So the following Sunday, we had a call with a couple of the big car companies, Aptiv, Lear, Magna was also on the call on the cadence on how we would work this work stream. And we are using OESA and MEMA and AAI to be the conduit to the supply base and the auto companies, input as well as output. And I think most on this call, if you haven't seen it yet, in talking to Ray Scott from Lear, they actually posted their playbook on the internet, okay, for the public domain. And it's well coordinated right now. Magna's finishing our playbook. What OESA is going to post, it will probably be in the next couple days, sent out to the supply base. And then I've also talked to Jerry Anderson, who heads up BLM, Business Leaders of Michigan, and he's probably going to distribute the same playbook throughout the state of Michigan, to all companies, whether they're automotive or not. So it's a well-coordinated effort.
Well, and the coordination is really, really important. I know if we had some fits and starts of automakers saying they were going to get online at a certain date, and suppliers, we have to have 2 or 3 weeks advance notice of that, and working capital requirements to restart production. So it's really important that this be a coordinated effort to help the suppliers and many of our small suppliers get on board and be able to come back. Magna, as we mentioned, has plants all over the world, and you've already restarted production in China. What lessons did you learn from restarting that production in your Asian facilities, and what carries over to your planning for the restart in North America?
Magna has a footprint in 27 countries, and China is big for us, over 58 plants and close to 20,000 employees. So we did do an effective lessons learned on how we got through, and more so how we came out of it, and we're using it as a baseline for our playbook. But the key fundamental difference that I see between China as well as versus the rest of the countries that we're talking about here today, in China there's mandates that come out from the central government. Versus here in the U.S. or Canada or Mexico, there's requests that come out. So discipline is the key to success. In China, they mandated things where over here, we're going to ask people to do things. We just have to make sure there's discipline when we start back up. But what I would encourage all suppliers that are working on or looking at a restart, you need to work with your customer and your suppliers on inventory management. That's a key thing that we looked at while we were shut down in China. So if you look at China, we were supposed to come, the 23rd is when we went into Chinese New Year. We were supposed to come out the end of January. It actually ended up the February 8th. And it was a very, very slow startup. And the one advantage we had was we understood inventory levels throughout the supply base, as well as between us and our customer. And we were able to prioritize accordingly. The government actually certified logistics between especially Wuhan and the rest of the country, so we could get goods to the plants that needed it. The cadence of startup in China was very slow. If you look at it, they're probably back to normal as of the end of March after starting back up the end of, or February 8th. So when I look at China, when I say normal, they're running now 2 shifts. When they first started up, it was 1 shift operation, and they had to really inform the people as to what was the new rules of engagement. And Aaron will comment on that later, but understanding and getting on the same page as your customer is very critical. And there's some of the suppliers here that need X amount of days to start up their manufacturing process. So if a car company is going to start up in early May, you need to understand when you have to start your supply base up and your plants up, and make sure it's in line with what the government's telling you can and can't do.
Great, that's really helpful. And early May, you mentioned we don't have any formal announcements from many of the automakers yet on their restart dates. We've seen a couple come out with some dates, but do you have any insights on?
No, I heard a lieutenant colonel from the military talk the other day, and he ran Navy SEALs for over 20 years. And 3 key takeaways that I had that resonate every day with me is he said, put away the map because the terrain will change daily. We're dealing with the invisible enemy here. If you need to make a decision, understand you need to make it with the facts that you have, understanding you're probably going to change it when new facts arise. And then he said, please put patience in front of prediction. So emphasizing patience right now.
Right. Very Bayesian. We go with what we know and we change as it goes along and we get more information. Aaron, what specific measures is Magna planning from a workforce perspective for restarting North American plants? And how are you going to synchronize Magna's ramp up with your customers and starting production, potentially at different levels and different timing? You know, how is that going to work from your perspective on the workforce side?
Yeah, so I think to Jim's points earlier, the work with OESA and the other tier ones and the large OEMs is absolutely critical for us to have some level of alignment in that startup so that we can be prepared, we can be ready to go. We're constantly communicating with our customers and our supply chain so that we're able to respond. Various programs starting up, shutting down, that's normal for our business. So even in these abnormal times, I think our flexibility and adaptability is core to success. I think it's also important to remember that some of our divisions in different parts of the world are still running or are running in part, whether that be to support medical emergency parts, frontline workers, or to support some customers in different parts of the world that are running. And we're adjusting our health and safety practices. Obviously, we've got a significant amount of work to ensure that the safety of our employees is put front and center in everything we do as we continue to operate and as we ramp up eventually. Finally, I think to your point around different timing, I think that actually helps us. The phasing in, the staged ramp up, if you will, I think that's going to help in social distancing as we roll out new HSE protocols. We want to make sure we plan it as best we possibly can, and then if we practice that with smaller groups of people first until we ramp up to full production. As those plants gradually and in a coordinated manner start filling up with more and more people and eventually get us to 100%, I think that phased ramp up is actually quite important, not only for Magna, but for the industry in total.
So, you know, workers are rightly concerned, I think, about the spread of COVID-19 in a manufacturing plant. You know, the auto industry is one where, you know, a couple hundred people show up at one time and they all touch the same product as it goes down an assembly line. It's very different from an office where maybe, you know, 50 or 100 people share the same coffee maker and restrooms. This is a much more open environment. And we've had, you know, cleaning and disinfecting kind of procedures in place for a while. But, you know, they're very concerned about how they can create these physical distances between workers, putting up barriers, the phasing shifts and breaks to minimize the physical closeness, these aggressive sanitation or more aggressive sanitation activities, and planning for temperature checks or other physical wellness checks and screening. What is Magna doing from an employee standpoint to protect the health and safety in the workplace?
Well, first off, I think we have a world-class health and safety team, and we have a culture of safety in our employees. It's a core principle in our employee charter. It's embedded in the way we work every single day. Jim mentioned before having insight from some of our divisions in China to guide and take some of the best practices we have to build for Europe and North America. I think that's been very helpful. So the basic structures that are needed in order to be successful in this ramp up, I think are in place, and we've learned some of those lessons. We've developed, I think it's 12 or 13 different protocols and procedures on the health and safety front, focused on screening, social distancing, PPE, obviously, decontamination or cleaning, and certainly the ramp ups there. And I think probably first and foremost, it seems pretty clear that personal hygiene, personal accountability, hand washing, coughing into your elbow, trying not to touch your face, and social distancing are the two best options we have to stop the spread. So we're taking those very seriously. We will be putting in many different efforts, whether it be everything that you just discussed, ensuring that people are well when they come to work, ensuring that we have physical distance between people when they are working, and if that can't be done through just moving people a little further apart, what are the barriers we're going to put up? And then obviously the PPE, which PPE should be the last resort and not the first. and obviously the PPE in place that we'll need. So we need to ramp that up. We need to train and educate our workforce and our leaders. But the health and safety of our workforce and bringing our industry back up in a safe manner is our highest priority. So in short, everything you talked about, we're absolutely looking at, and the medical advice from our medical team, as well as the medical advice from the WHO or the CDC, is absolutely foundational in all of the plans we have from a health and safety perspective.
You know, we have workers in other industries that are out there on the front lines now, medical workers, you know, people working in the food supply chain and in, you know, groceries and restaurants that are still operating to some degree. One of the big barriers we have is really a lack of widespread testing. That's happened in South Korea, it's happened in Germany. It seems to be, you know, one of the strategies that works to, you know, get our arms around the problem. Do you foresee the need for widespread surveillance testing of the automotive workforce? And are there technologies that can be deployed to help control the spread of COVID-19, make it safe for workers to return to their offices and factories, like rapid testing or air filtration, or any things that we would have to really implement in a widespread manner? Yeah, cannot hear you. Can you hear me? Aaron, we cannot hear you. Jim, do you want to answer?
I was waiting for Aaron to answer. You know, I think we continue to learn what's out there. We had a call with some of the healthcare companies on how they're operating amongst COVID-19. One in particular is 3M, and they talked to us about their practices as they run their plants today. So we're looking at it, the widespread testing. I can't answer that. I know there's a lot going on in that area. I would have to say more news later on that.
So Jim, you know, automakers were already dealing with some supply chain disruptions from the initial COVID-19 outbreaks. What do you see happening in the supply chain to minimize the risks of those disruptions from Asia, Europe, North American sources?
You know, understanding the value stream of management is of key importance. And every day when we were shut down in China, our purchasing and operations team were meeting daily, as Aaron mentioned earlier, talking to suppliers, ensuring that they were ready to go when we needed them to start. And then secondarily, the government was touching base with them on their financial status. We looked at their supply base operationally, logistics, but then also financially. I think it's very important that we make sure that they have the cash that they need to start the industry back up when we need them.
So we have one question on this whole PPE in the factory. Aaron, you mentioned that PPE is sort of the last thing after you've implemented all these other protocols. What is the criteria for the use of masks, if any, in a manufacturing environment?
So again, I think you touched on it. Masks is a last resort, and critical in our understanding of how and what masks we want to use is making sure that those on the front lines have the available masks, the N95s that are required. Those are the people that are in harm's way every moment of every day, which would be different than you or I at home or in an office typically. So most of the reason to use a mask is to prevent me from infecting you. It doesn't necessarily prevent me being infected. So there are some good steps that can be taken with procedural or surgical masks. I think you've seen recently the CDC has come out and recommended cloth masks or face coverings even. So I think there is some value in it, but as a last line of defense and making sure that whatever we do, we don't impact first responders and the critical PPE that they need. That's something that is constantly top of mind. I don't think it's fair to assume that the auto industry needs to be up and manufacturing while doctors and nurses aren't able to operate safely in the environments that they're
are going without their N95 or any other PPE. So Jim, United States, Canada, and Mexico make vehicles together. We're very integrated in our supply chains. Of the three countries, it does seem that the Mexican government has been the slowest in coming on board to stop the spread of COVID through the WHO recommended comprehensive measures. Can you talk a little bit about your assessment of the ability of the North American supply chain to bounce back? And do you have concerns about a restart in Mexico?
Yeah, I got a great question, Kristin. Going back to about March 13th to the 20th, we could see behaviors in Mexico that weren't consistent with what the U.S. and Canada were doing. So we did document letters to President Obrador, and then the 10 governors of the provinces we have facilities, okay? And then in parallel to that, we've got very good contacts with the Canadian government, and Don Walker, our CEO, went right to Premier Trudeau. I have had a number of conversations with U.S. Congress, so they would also have a look in discussions with Mexico to make sure they're doing what they should be doing. And I've had 3 calls with Congresswoman Slotkin over it, and she's been great in D.C. to make sure that between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico, we get alignment. And I think it's much better today than, say, it was 3 weeks ago.
I remember when we talked in August last year at our conference up in Traverse City, you mentioned that you took on government relations and you thought, oh, this is just going to be a little thing I do on the side, a couple hours a month, maybe. Has that really expanded for you in this period? And you know, how much of your effort are you spending there, and how successful are you feeling you are?
Well, my title changed in January because I stepped down as CMO. And I was getting down to about 50 hours a week, and now I'm back up to the 80, 90, but it's all for a great cause because we got to get the industry, we got to get the countries back working again.
Right. So, Jim, North American suppliers are facing serious liquidity and cash flow squeeze in the coming months, given the current zero revenue environment facing the automakers and the payment terms that suppliers are on. You know, the 30 to 60-day payments are going to run out. This issue is really magnified for suppliers because of the falling cash payments from the automakers and their current payment terms. And the prospect of their significant working capital investments that they're going to have to ramp up to restart production, all happening at the same time. What can the industry do to address the cash squeeze that small suppliers are facing? And, you know, knowing that almost 80% of the supply chain is a firm that's fewer than 100 employees, and we have many of them probably on this call today. So what are we doing to help bridge that liquidity?
You know, we're talking to the OEMs, number one, to make sure we have a realistic startup plan. The start-stop does not help liquidity because we start buying material, we start employing people, then they say we're going to push it on another 2 weeks. So we're working daily with the car companies to make sure they have a realistic start date that's in line with containment of this virus. That's number one. Number two, every country is looking at different things to help the people of the country and the companies within that country. And we see, for example, in the U.S., the U.S. CARES Act and what unfolded from that. We've gotten correspondence relative to that from our customers, and we're taking it right to our supply base. We're assuming they may not have this information. We're getting it to them so that they understand what's available out there, because there will be some issues. And we also have informed the car companies we really got to work together on this. Now, I can tell you from experience in China, we stayed ahead of this, and we did not lose any production relative to a supplier that went bankrupt because we were talking to them all the way through this, and the government was stepping in where they needed to. So we got a big download from Ford Motor Company on Saturday. It went to every supplier within Magna, within the United States, so that they were informed as to what they could do. And we continue to do that on a daily basis.
Well, and legislatively, there's been some news in the last couple of days about augmenting the CARES Act with more funds into the existing programs. Secretary Mnuchin asked for doubling the Paycheck Protection Program funds, which were expecting to be oversubscribed at the rate that the applications came in starting last Friday. So there is some movement legislatively to try to get some more money out. And, you know, we're very much in a different situation than we were in the last financial crisis, where all suppliers are impacted, all automakers are impacted, and every business in the United States is impacted, not just, and in North America, not just certain automakers or certain suppliers in this trouble. So it's a very different situation and a much healthier industry going into it too.
Yes.
But it's the duration of the shutdown that's really critical to us. Jim, while Magna is one of the largest tier 1 auto suppliers in the world, that U.S. supply chain has about 3,100 firms that employ those fewer than 100 workers. What else can we be doing to help them bridge the gap and resume production on the other side? And, you know, Aaron, you may be able to join in here too. You know, how about if they cannot get a hold of PPE, they can't get the disinfecting materials, the protocols that they need. I mean, you're sharing the playbooks, and they can take those and adapt them to their own plants. But are there things that we can be doing, adjusting payment terms, maybe even to help keep them going, in addition to the government support that they're getting?
You know, we're addressing it case by case, company by company, making sure they get the information they need. I think the key point that you just brought up is when we went into this, we were a very healthy industry. We just came off, you know, a 17 million unit year in North America. We were headed towards a 16 million unit year this year, I think, or 16.2, that will go down. So the suppliers were in a lot better financial shape than we were in 08, 09. And I think we just need to over communicate the playbook on how we start up operationally, financially, and top priority being health and safety of the employees.
Yeah, Jim, I would jump in that, you know, the coordination between our supply base and the OEMs is absolutely crucial in terms of startup times, sharing the playbook and what are the materials, the disinfectants, the PPE requirements that we have in our plants, and how we expect that to flow through our supply base is key. And quite frankly, I think we do have some time. Jim talked about a coordinated startup at some point in time in the future, and we talked a little earlier about phasing that in. Now's the time to get ready. And if we're supplying that information and being clear in those needs, you can see with China back up and manufacturing that the ability to procure some of these materials, N95s and some of that specialist material aside, there is the ability to do that now. So let's take the couple of weeks that we may have to ramp up in a coordinated way, but to make sure our supply base understands what they need. And quite honestly, if we need to help, our suppliers are integral. We want them when we're back to normal, whenever that is. We're going to need them when we're back to normal. And so those folks, those companies, knowing they can rely on Magna, that's important to us and important to our brand.
So Jim, you mentioned that we, in this conversation about we were healthier for this crisis to come on, but this is a really, really big crisis. And we had a lot of, across the industry, a lot of investments planned in capacity, in automation and R&D, electrification, automation. Companies were putting big, billions and billions of dollar bets on these new technologies and new products. How does that look on the other side of this crisis? Do you think, how do we prioritize those investments across those different categories when there's likely going to be less money to do those investments?
Well, I think first and foremost, we have to look at restarting the industry and financially, what is that going to take? The second thing we're doing right now in working with our customers is understanding program delays. Some are giving us some color on program delays. It could be this year and next year, 20 and 21, which we're looking at what capital can we delay based on program delays. And I do believe over the course of the next few months, there's going to be more program delays. But when you look at electrification, or you look at level 2, 2.5, which is where the ADAS focus is these days, I think it'll continue on. It's too early to tell really how much it will slow down. And we continue to talk to our customers on a timely basis on that. But there could be some impact. But remember what I said earlier, let's have a little patience before we predict where we may reduce spending or focus on R&D, okay?
Well, and I think, one of the things we expect we might see, at least at the Center for Automotive Research, is more tie-ups, more partnerships, more joining together. We saw some of that this week in the announcement, or I guess last week, from GM and Honda on a co-production arrangement, expanding their partnership that they had on transmissions. If things get to be, these big investments have to be made, and they, can mitigate some of the risk and share some of that investment across companies. That's one of the trends we're looking for, to see if that happens over time. One of the investments, though, that we might not have been planning for is maybe increased automation. There's certain areas of production where there's close physical contact, and those might be candidates for automation, just to maintain physical distance between people. Aaron, is there anything that you think about in terms of a role for increased automation in the post-COVID-19 automotive manufacturing space? And what would be considerations for deploying additional automation at Magna?
Yeah, so I think in all honesty, Kristin, we're focused on getting through this crisis today. And I think we can, through appropriate physical distancing and barriers, that's the response we need to make today. It's not about implementing automation. We're focused on ensuring that the people in our business have job security. The industry will continue to automate. Factories will become smarter. That's absolutely something that will continue to happen. I don't personally believe that COVID-19 speeds that up or slows that down. So I haven't been in a ton of consideration. We're focused on making sure that a person who previously had a job comes back successfully, safely, and can help us move our industry forward.
I think for the benefit of those on the call, when we were in China, we said, okay, assume physical distancing will be effective until further notice. So look at your raw material incoming to your finished goods going out and see where you have to make modifications, whether it's move them apart or put a barrier in between like plexiglass to ensure social distancing is maintained. That is what everybody has to do today.
So let's talk about, I sort of have three buckets. There's disruption, there's demand, and then there's the health and safety. We've talked about the first and the third bucket that I talk about. Let's talk a little bit about demand. We've seen consumer demand starting to spring back in China. We've seen that happen before in other flu outbreaks in Asia with H1N1 or SARS, that there was a real strong spring back in Asian car demand because people were moving out of shared spaces like public transit into personal car ownership as a protective little bubble. Here in North America, lots of people already have personal car ownership. We have one of the highest personal car ownership rates in the world. What concerns do you have about demand coming back in the North American market, and what can be done to bring people back into the market? I hesitate to say showrooms because that may be a long way off, and we're going to address that in our webinar that we're doing the week of April 20th with the dealers and how they're changing their model. But how do we bring people back to buying cars?
And again, we model North America, the Americas and Europe based on what we see going on in China. And if you look at China, one thing that we don't have is there's many people in China that use public transportation as their main method to get around. They didn't even own a car. Because of the fear of COVID-19, it's had a positive impact on car sales in China because those that didn't own a car and could afford to buy one are buying cars today. If you look at overall demand in China, it is increasing. The government stepping in on additional license plate issuance in Shanghai and other areas. They're maintaining the rebate on BEVs in China. But we see overall in China year over year, and IHS and Bernstein are in line with us, about a 13 to 15% decrease over 19. okay, year over year. This year, we started the year on 16.2 million in production, not sales, production. And the first 2 months were okay, but we see a flattening throughout the year. We've reduced in our financial modeling, we reduced volumes again about 2 weeks ago, and IHS is pretty much in line with what we predicted about 2 weeks ago, and that's what we're using for financial forecasting. Because, you know, we got to be sensible that the consumer has to have stability before they go back out in the marketplace to buy big ticket items. So we're going to have a slow creep in production. And if you look at inventory, in January, our inventory level in the U.S. was at 76 days. Then it was down to 69 days at the end of February, then shot up to 95 days of inventory into March, which I assume it'll be the end of April too. None selling, and we're not building. So the OEMs have a 95-day inventory level, and there will be a slow cadence of startup based on strategically what models they feel they will sell here in 20 and 21. But I think there will be a pause with some consumers on purchasing vehicles.
Well, and you know, the three of us, I think Aaron's the only one in the office today. I'm in my son's bedroom, and Jim in your home office. What impact do you think everybody's working from home who can has on automotive demand? I mean, I think I never thought I would do very well with this myself. It's worked out much better than I had expected to keep, you know, communications with my team and do all the things that I do normally in an office or out meeting with clients. You know, this web visual teleconferencing has helped a lot too. What do we think that does to demand if, you know, a lot of white collar workers who can work from home start working from home and our vehicle miles traveled start to drop?
And I do believe when we start up, those that can effectively 100% work from home will be the case in the short term, because that's what we did in China to manage the flow of people back into the public domain. And it could be here, but I still think people will need vehicles. I'm not the consumer expert, but I still believe people will need vehicles.
I have a new driver in my house, or at least one in training. So we've that's the only thing we've been doing is driving to practice, so he can get his license. We've got a couple of questions from the audience that I'm going to pull in. Jim, they want to know, are all of your Chinese plants running 2 shifts? And to what OEMs are those parts being shipped? And who's receiving the parts if the vehicle plants are still shut down?
In general, most of the big guys are back up and running. They started with 1 shift in February, and by the end of March, they got to 2 shifts. So it's my belief every one of our plants, except for a couple in Wuhan, are not up and running. They are slowly starting to ramp up in Wuhan, but the plants across the balance of China have been up and running.
Great. And then there's a question for you, Aaron. Are companies like Magna or others looking for technology partners to help with solutions to monitor social distancing or other safety measures for the Safe Startup Initiative? Are there task forces that we should get involved with to help? And maybe this is, you know, wearables in the workplace or things that will help monitor what's going on the shop floors.
Yeah, so we have some learnings out of China with this. I think the monitoring of your location with your phone is probably something a little more sensitive in North America to people. And so I think if before we tread into those waters, I think we would assess it and do it very carefully. So from a social distancing standpoint, I don't think it's the passive monitoring is really where we're looking. We're looking at physically separating people to make sure that the virus doesn't spread. We are looking at technology partners in terms of helping people assess or self-assess their physical health every single day and can help make a determination as to whether or not they come to work. One of the key areas of Magna's focus in the startup procedures is going to be making sure that if you're sick, you aren't at work. And so we need to make sure we understand that, and people take ownership that. I take ownership of that, Jim and all of our management team do as well. So we want some effective, innovative efficient solutions to help us in that space. I don't think we're yet at the point where there's a level of comfort around tracking every movement with our cell phone. But it is certainly something that could be an outcome of this in the medium term.
You know, one of the things that I encountered, I had a medical appointment a couple weeks ago, and the person checking me in was obviously sick. A medical professional who like takes your blood pressure and weighs you. She was obviously sick, and when I asked her why she was at work, the second week of March, she said, "I have PTO, and I have to save it for my vacation. I can't be sick. I have to save it for vacation." And I know I've heard some conversations about people hoarding their PTO and not wanting to use it for sick. And we used to have sick days and vacation days as separate things. Do you see any trends in how we allocate sick days or unlimited sick days if you are experiencing a COVID-19 infection, or how are we going to break that mental barrier of I'm keeping my PTO because that's my vacation?
Yeah, I think it starts with actually some of the good work that governments have done in many different jurisdictions. And if you are sick with COVID or diagnosed with COVID and you need to stay self-isolated, assuming you're obviously well enough to isolate at home, then there are usually programs in place to keep people financially secure in that. So paid sick leave, call it any name you want, depending on the jurisdiction that you're in. So there are some good programs out there for that. I think many big companies also have short-term absences and other items that can be there. And some companies like Magna and others have gone above and beyond in that case to make sure our employees are taken care of. It's more important to us that if people are sick, that they stay home. And we realize that that may open us up to some abuse, but I think it's tiny. I think that 99.9% of our employees treat this well. They treat it with respect. They appreciate what the company or their government is doing for them in times like this. So I'm not overly concerned about the abuse side of that. We want those employees back. PTO, we're seeing different trends in different parts of the world, and I suppose a couple of years ago it was moving from sick into PTO. I don't know if this will change the PTO argument. I think companies just need to trust their employees, to treat them well, to manage it appropriately. And if you've got solid governments in place that are providing good programs, I think holistically that employee is taken care of, and that allows companies to operate safely because we don't have sick people that have to come to work no matter what.
Right, and I think that has been sort of a badge of honor. I'm here through all of my illness, and I'm still showing up because I'm so dedicated. Is another view of, or I'm hoarding my vacation days. So it's good to have that message from the top of, if you're sick, we don't really want you here. We want you to be better.
I think these times, Kristin, are also showing us that co-workers, it doesn't need to be a manager or a leader saying stay home or you self-assess and you stay home. There's a significant amount of peer pressure amongst co-workers now that if you come in and you're coughing, they're going to say go home. Mm-hmm. And so that has an impact as well. We don't want our employees to be there, but I think it'd be foolish of us not to recognize that exists.
So Jim, I want to turn to Magna really jumped into the what we've called the arsenal of health activities very early on. Can you talk a little bit about what your company is doing on medical and PPE production side of things?
Yeah, when we got into this in early to mid-March, the first thing we saw in the medical product and PPE space is we were falling all over each other, auto suppliers, auto companies. So the second work stream that we got on the same page with all the car companies is let's coordinate where it makes sense to support PPE and medical products. And we've got about 20 different work streams. We have a program manager on, for lack of a better term, first and foremost to produce product or support the production of product for the first responders. So Ford Motor Company came out with a face shield that they are now producing. We talked to Ford because we were designing our own, and we're now producing the one that Ford's producing, and we're almost up to 55,000 per week that we're producing. And then Honda called the other day and said that they were going to start producing face shields. Well, guess what? We got them forged design, and they're just going to use the same design. And we're looking at ventilator parts, respirator parts. Every day something comes up. We talked to one of the medical product people. They needed some rapid tuning done. So we have a list of all the 3D printers across the company and where our rapid tuning capabilities are to look at rapid tuning for tools, for molded parts, and then 3D printing of components. But the key thing I think everybody needs to understand from a PPE perspective, get your indirect purchasing people to start looking at the supply and demand out there. In the month of March only, China exported 3.9 billion, not million, billion masks out of China. That doesn't include their domestic consumption. So there's auto companies already that have vertically integrated material, the cloth masks. We have a plan to vertically integrate cloth masks within Magna. It's a dynamic plan. We've gotten with the guys that are already in production, like GM and FCA and Ford, and we're sharing all the information across all the supply base just to make sure that we understand what will those needs be when the health and safety guidelines are completed. So we're actually expediting manufacturing of material mass to vertically integrate in the regions that we operate. So a lot going on, first and foremost for first responders, secondarily for our longer term needs.
You know, I read an article in the Dallas Morning News. There's a domestic manufacturer of masks. He ramped up in the H1N1 outbreak, and added a lot of capacity. And then when things went back to normal, he found that many of his customers who said they would be there for him went back to import sources for masks and personal protective equipment. That was, and so the story is, they're not busting the doors down at that particular plant, because he's like, I'm not going to ramp up again only to have my customers go away and I have to lay off a bunch of people. What is your intent to stay in PPE and medical manufacturing activities once the production gets back online? You're going to need it for your own production and for the automakers and other suppliers who may not be producing these particular products. But how much longer will you stay in medical device and PPE?
So I think we're going to stay in it as long as we need to support our first responders, and then more so the health and safety of our people. Secondarily, I do believe, in talking to some of the U.S. Congress people, that localization of PPE and medical products will change based on what happened here over the last 2 months. Because across North America, you're right. A lot of that supply went away and it got concentrated in one country. And it's a bottleneck right now. So I do believe there's going to be more localization of those products over time. And it's not our intent at this point to stay in it. We're doing it because we feel we need to.
And what are you doing with the production of these? You're running this manufacturing right now. What are you doing for workstation standards for PPE, like the face shields? Are you trying out some of your distancing and other ramp up playbook in this environment where you're making medical devices and PPE?
Yeah, Jim, I can touch on that. So the physical distancing or the social distancing and the barriers is the most effective tool. And as I said previously, PPE would be secondary to that, whether it be a face mask or a surgical mask that you would typically see, whether that be a face mask plus goggles or plus a face shield. I think it really depends on the nature of the risk and how many engineered controls we can put in so that you don't have the risk where your last line of defense is something like a shield. Obviously, there will be workers that can't socially distance. The nature of their job requires them to be in different positions, either close to one another or for example, the cleaning staff in a facility that will be cleaning high touch surfaces on a more regular basis and the like. So I think we are looking at it from a work product perspective first, social distancing and or barriers second, and then PPE. So if you can't physically distance, if you're in that high risk area, then a face shield might be appropriate for you. Otherwise, it might be a face mask and goggles, etc. But I think it's too broad to say everybody has a face shield in any of our circumstances.
And what about the training of the workforce? You know, that's one of the things that we've heard about is in medical and medical offices and hospitals, there's extensive training about, you know, not cross-contaminating. You know, if you have gloves on your hands and then you touch your phone and then you touch your face, you've just cross-contaminated yourself. So what are we going to do to train workers in how to operate in this environment and have these protections in place for them, for their own health and for their coworkers' health? It seems like it's a pretty big task too.
It is a pretty big task, and I think companies and certainly Magna have a responsibility to educate and train their leaders and their employees. Putting on a face mask, it's pretty easy, but I think the training, like as you say, comes with cross-contamination. How do you dispose? When do you dispose? How is that taken care of then? And when are you in a situation where you're required to put on additional PPE? So that's something, whether it's in the COVID crisis that we're in or simply in changing around people's jobs. We've got a very strong training team. We've rolled some of this out in China, as we've said before. We have some of the materials, lots and lots of communication, lots of posters, lots of very simple procedures. The simpler, the better. The easier, the better. And we're perhaps over communicating in the beginning, but that'll probably protect our workforce the most in the end. So absolutely, training is a component of any response plan to this.
I think we're going to come back to one more topic that comes from our audience about the changeover from NAFTA to USMCA. This might be for you, Jim, but you know, these auto suppliers and the automakers are now looking at a potential, according to the U.S. administration, at least, a June 1st entry into force for new requirements for the content of the vehicles, of parts, just wholly new certifications they'll have to do for labor value standards and steel and aluminum purchases. What is Magna doing on getting us in a state where we can comply with the new trade regime as that gets rolled out, you know, sometime this year probably, but you know, the administration is on a plan for June 1st.
We were already talking to the administration in the U.S. as well as Canadian and Mexican governments that June 1st, even before this COVID-19 started, was not realistic for our industry, and that it needed to be pushed out to January of next year. I would hope people get sensible here on the implementation of USMCA, that we have higher priorities to take care of before we start jumping into USMCA. We got to get the industry back up and running. And I think that's everybody's top priority.
I think that seems to be everybody's top priority here, and we certainly have had a lot of interest and engagement from our audience here today. I want to thank both of you, Jim and Aaron, for joining us and for having this very informative discussion. Jim, I want to leave you with the parting shots. Are there any actions that you want the participants on this call, you know, smaller suppliers, other automakers, or your co-work, you know, other suppliers, tier 1s and tier 2s, that you want them to take, and the priorities that they should be marching through in the next few weeks as we ramp up?
You know, first and foremost, don't underestimate how much the medical community needs our assistance right now. We're talking to the Detroit Chamber daily on making sure we can assist in getting PPE and medical products to the first responders. You know, even talk to your local hospitals on if they need food. Some of the cafeterias in these hospitals are shut down. So, you know, ask the question of your local government on what you can do to help right now to get our arms around this while maintaining all the rules and regulations of social distancing. Secondarily, don't let a day go by to prepare your suppliers and your employees for restart. the education process, making sure that your suppliers are ready to start up when you need them to start up. And the tier ones are working directly with the car companies to make sure we have realistic dates to start up based on what's going on with this COVID-19 across the country, across the 3 countries. So over communicate.
Great. Well, this has been really very insightful. I really thank you both for joining us. For the participants, please come back again next week. We're going to look at how 3D printing is being used in this COVID-19 crisis. And then the week after, we're going to look at the dealership side, which will have a little bit more information on how demand looks and how we might meet demand in a social distancing kind of way. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. The webinar will be posted on our website later today. And we thank you for your support of the Center for Automotive Research, and yours as well, Jim and Aaron. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kristin.